Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this week's session of Automation Hour. We are thrilled that you are here joining us. We'll go through some quick housekeeping items before we get to the crux of our presentation today, which is going to be fabulous. So Monica, if you want to jump to our first slide, we'll talk through some logistics here. So we do have all of the lines muted. However, we love the interaction from our audience. So please post your questions in the question widget here and go to webinar. Go ahead and post them to the Automation Hour Trailblazer community if you like. We'll be monitoring both of those and we'll make sure we get your questions answered. We are recording this and we will be posting this to our YouTube channel after we're done rendering that video. And of course, you can reach us in a variety of ways. All of our social media profiles are listed. So Twitter, LinkedIn, Trailblazer community, wherever it makes the most sense for you. We invite you to connect with us. All right, so we have gone boot camp this year. The first half of the year, we talked a little bit about strategy and how to prepare for some automation. And we jumped into how to actually build some of those things, the building blocks that you're going to have on your canvas. You know, what kind of record triggered flows and screen flows that you could build, schedule and platform event triggered. And as we've gone into the second half of the year, we have not only wrapped up kind of building those flows, but now we're also getting into some of the finer points. Now that you have sort of that basis and talking about some of the other automation options, and now we're getting into best practices and migration strategies, things to help you be able to do more with Flow and do it the right way. So we hope that you'll consider joining us for some additional sessions. We are hard at work prepping for what we're going to bring you next year. So hopefully we'll have more information for you on that in a few short weeks. All right, so we cannot bring you this webinar without the support of our amazing sponsors. So we want to make sure we shout them out. Concrete.io has been with us since the inception. So we want to say a huge thank you to them for staying with us for the last 6 years that we've been doing Automation Hour. And of course, we cannot do this without our other sponsor, Active Campaign. Is the next slide up, I think? Yep. Oh, good. I can't actually remember. Perfect. So yes, Active Campaign has come on board and they are supporting us through all of our email marketing so that we can remind you about these great webinars that are coming up to make sure that you can join and get all this great information on automation. All right, so you've got your co-host for the day. You've got me, Michelle Hansen, as well as Rakesh Gupta. But we know you're not here to see us. You're here for the amazing content that is going to be brought by Monica Sandberg, MVP, Flow Extraordinaire, also known in the community far and wide as Not As Blank. Monica also helped co-found the Fly In Solo and the eComa My initiatives at Dreamforce to help welcome new people to the community, and she just keeps going. So Monica, I am going to turn this over to you to help you share your experiences with Flow and what best practices have come out of that.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you, thank you. I am really happy to be here. I'm thrilled to be here. I think this is my 5th Automation Hour. I never thought that would happen. I am known more in the community as Not As Blank Monica. And I'm an architect and admin, and I've been a Flownatic since you had to install something on your computer to run Flow. And it's been a long journey, and I have learned a lot, and a lot from fails, from things that have gone wrong. So we're going to talk about best practices. And first, I do want to remind you that I don't have all the answers. But I do have lots and lots of questions, and I know you don't have all the answers, and that's okay. Salesforce doesn't have all the answers, and some of the things we're going to talk about are things that have changed over time. And I want to remind you as well, because I never imagined I'd be speaking at conferences, and I spoke at Dreamforce and Trailblazer DX and other conferences throughout the year, that you do know more than you think you do. And you also, I guarantee you, you can do more than you think you can. So let's get started. I'm starting with the most fun. I know you're excited, documenting flows. Oh my God. I know this is something, it's like pulling. I mean, I'd rather have a tooth pulled sometimes. But I'm gonna show you how I do it and how I have figured out how less is more with documentation. Absolutely, positively necessary. And now when I was doing screen flows, you had maybe 5, 6 screen flows in your org. You have hundreds of flows possibility. You could have thousands of flows in your org if you build them with a certain architecture. So it's super important that we have documentation. And what is the documentation? Well, in my view, the documentation is the flow itself and not some external documentation. And it starts with naming. How do you name your flow? So I mentioned that I started out and it was screen flows, and that was easy. I could just name it update contacts. Okay, woo. But now I developed my own naming convention about 5, 6 years ago, and I have had to tweak it and change it and adjust it over time. But I definitely have a naming convention. And I'm going to show you how that really, really helps. Now, I don't say that you're welcome to borrow mine. I can post this after this session. There are many other people that have really good naming conventions to take a look at theirs. You can create your own naming convention, but it's super important that you have a methodology, that you do your naming a certain way and not just name it any old thing, any old time. And you're going to see why and how having the right naming convention can really help you with other best practices and can really aid you in your automation. And so I'm going to show you I'm in a developer org, so I just made these nice and clean just to show you to get a sense. I start with an automation number. Now, when I had 5 flows, big deal. Now, like I said, you could have hundreds, and each flow should have a unique number. And that way you know which flow you're talking about. And then I talk about here's a screen flow in user mode, running on opportunity. We're fixing client account data, and I'm going to update the related account. It's clear as day. I can glance at it and know what that flow is and what it's doing and why it's doing it. And then in your description, you don't have to write a book. You just need the important information. And if you do something like this, I can glance again and know what those flows are doing, what are my triggers, and what I'm trying to accomplish. And here's an account flow, record trigger flow before save. It's doing client billing. And because it's a before save, I don't have to say it's updating account because I know by definition it's updating the account. So here I'm putting in the trigger order. And sometimes that's really important. You want to know that one flow is really important to you and you have a high trigger order because it needs to be last, or a really low number because you want it to happen early in the transaction. And so here's another one. It's a record trigger flow before save. And I'm doing it, the purpose of that flow is to count my duplicate records. And you just get a sense here that the idea is not something that is really difficult. It's just that you need to be consistent, and it's going to change over time. I know you're going to come up with a naming convention, or you're going to try out mine or somebody else's, and you're going to be tweaking it. And you're going to say, I don't really, that doesn't make sense to me. I don't know what it is. And it's going to happen over time where you get to a standard that works for you. But it's important to have that standard. And then it's not just the name of the flow. Readability of the flow itself. If you name it right, you will understand what's happening from top to bottom, and you won't have to click through to those descriptions. And so you can see here an example of what I've done here is that I know that I'm getting contacts, but not just any contacts. I'm getting the contacts related to this account. And I know I'm running this flow on account because of the name of my flow. So current account is the flow that I'm running the flow from, that record. And so you would use record ID, that's how I do it, and use record ID to get all of the values of all the fields from my current account. And if you do this, and this is going to take a little experimentation, and I'm just going to show you how I do it. I'm not going to say it's the right way, the only way, but as you can see how simple this is to read and understand what I'm doing. Now, the assignments, if I'm only going to assign one variable, I like to name the actual assignment with that name. And I can do that by just using underscore assign. As long as my API name is different, I can have the variable with the exact same name as the assignment for the variable. And that makes it, to me, easier to match up and to see what I'm doing. So here you can see that I have an outcome. And on the outcomes, I like to explain exactly what is happening there. And I'm very detailed with my outcomes because that API is what Salesforce shows you in the debug. But on my labels, I like to make it easy to understand and read. So I like yes, no, error, update, those type of things for my decisions. So I don't have to read a book and try and figure out what the path is doing. And so here we have a screen, and I'm describing that I'm dealing with the current account, and we're talking about the billing address, and I had in there the word input. Input means to me that I know, I can glance and know my user is going to give me some information. And all of the elements, everything here, all of the components on the screen, the naming really does matter. And remember that your API name does not have to be the same as your label. So in my API name, I'm saying underscore input, so that if I see that component, if I see that anywhere and I'm trying to assign a value, I know that that's coming from my user, that I underscored input. And then I would underscore formula so that I know that it's coming from a formula, and that it wasn't just some value that I got from somewhere else. And so you see I have underscore data table. This is just an example of how I do my naming. And you can see right there that is my get, the count from my contacts get records is what I'm using for my component visibility. So you've put some thought into your names, then you're really able, you can see I have exit, input error, that means my user made a mistake and I'm gonna give them a screen to have them fix it. And all of these things, it's just a simple yes, no. However it works for you, whatever methodology you use, if you're consistent, it makes it much easier. Now, another thing is I usually describe, I don't just say account, or I just don't use the word contact. I say, is it the current account? Is it an updated account? Is it an account for a certain type of record type? And I want to know that so that I understand what the transaction is doing, because you could be getting records for something that doesn't have to do with this particular account. And you get an idea here of what I'm doing with my naming. Now, when you do your naming and you've got your flow built, you could check the manager and see what the naming is. And my rule of thumb is if I read those names and can't understand what's happening just from scrolling down and reading those names, I haven't done a good job in my naming. I need to understand exactly what's happening. And again, those are API names. Your labels can be much shorter, can be user-friendly if you're using them on a screen. But the API name, look, that's what we're looking at here is API names, that we should have something that is really, really understandable and going to be meaningful to us, rather than having to click through and do the descriptions to understand. So now that was one best practice. And now we're going to talk about another best practice, which is flow access. And all flows should have a bypass built in. And a bypass means that you don't have to go activate and inactivate. You have a way of turning off either one flow at a time or all of your flows or flows for a certain object, whatever you need to do quickly and easily. And the other is not to allow every user access to every flow. So you can restrict access, and you can restrict access to screen flows. And what some people don't realize is you should also think about restricting access to your record trigger flows. So let's talk about how do we do this. Let's start with the screen flow bypass. So I am using, and there's a lot of different ways to do this, but I like custom metadata. I've been doing this about 6 years. It works really, really well, and I'm making use of that automation number. The automation number makes this super, super easy because I have a unique number for each flow. And so I won't have to activate and deactivate. All I need to do is use that custom metadata. And I'm using my automation number to decide which flow am I turning on or off. So if you notice here, this is the simplest version of the switch. I have some that are more complex that do more, but it's just on or off, okay? And a custom metadata just looks like an object. And see here, it says object name. So you create it, you go to custom metadata, you say new, and you create it. And now you create fields, just like you would create fields on any object. We have automation number, and it is a unique field. I'm going to show you more on that in just a second. And then I just have a pick list that's on or off. That's it, on, off. Simple, simple, simple. And the automation number, I set it as text so that I can also ensure that it's unique, so that I do not use the same number twice. And a length could be 3, 4, whatever you want. 4 is a good number. I don't expect that I'm going to have 10,000 flows. Boy, I hope not. Then I would be in trouble. Okay, so for record trigger flows, I use custom settings. I don't do it this way, but I'm going to show you this first. So on my screen flow, the first thing that I need to do is I've named my flow with 315. So I need to tell my flow that 315 is the automation number. And I do an assignment. And what you can do is you can do a build this as a subflow and then just bring in that automation number as an input. So we do a get records, and that is of the object, which is metadata, but it comes up just like any other object, and looking for the one that matches the number that I've just assigned. There should only be one because it is unique. And then I'm simply checking, is it on or is it off? That's it, that simple. So I have off as my outcome and on as my default. And I can see I have a little name problem on that outcome on this developer work. So that should say just off outcome instead of on off. But there's off, and then on is the default. On is the default. And so then I have two paths. One path is going to continue on with my flow. And this is something I do. I'm just sharing this with you. All of my flows have a little do nothing variable. It's a Boolean, a true false. And I love that variable because I can use that and whenever I just want to debug something. And here we are. We've done a debug, and we have found out that this flow is off because it went to do nothing. And I know that's true because I saw the off setting when I was showing you the metadata. I had 3015 set as off. So it works as expected. And then all you'd have to do and not activate and deactivate, if there's some reason you want to take that flow offline, is you simply change your setting in your custom metadata. Okay, now we're going to talk about restricting user access. And you're going to say, well, I run my flows in user mode. I don't need to restrict access. In my opinion, all screen flows should restrict access to only the users that need them. And even if you're in user mode, how are you keeping track of every object that every user has rights to? How are you going to know if someone has access or doesn't have access to your flow? And then if someone who doesn't have access clicks through, and let's say they don't have access to account, like this one, and they click a button that goes to this flow, they're just going to get a nasty error message. But if you actually restrict access, you will avoid all of that. And the way you do it is you click Edit Access. So you create your flow first, and now you do this. You click Override. And Override changes default. Default is everyone can see everything. Now, they might get to the flow and have an error because they don't have access to that object, but it still doesn't restrict them from seeing the flow sometimes. So what you want to do is override. And this has an option to choose what profiles you want access. I do not recommend that because Salesforce is moving away from profiles and onto permission sets. So we are going to set the default, and now we're going to set and create a permission set. Now, what you need to do here is first activate your flow. If your flow is not activated, it won't show on the permission set list. So we're activating our flow. And now I'm going to show you how we can do a permission set. Now, I've started this one already to get us going a little quicker here. And this is for the flow we were just talking about, 3015. And as you can see, the name of my permission set matches the name of my flow. I cannot get this wrong. And because I named this flow so well, in my permission set, I know what this flow is and I know what this flow is doing. Exactly. The naming convention can really help you. And now on my description, I'm choosing who should have access, my customer service department. So it may be one person, it may be a group, it may be a persona, but you want to kind of have an idea of who should be using this flow. Very rarely is everyone in your org using all of your screen flows. And so the way that we add that flow is we go to flow access, and then we choose the flow that we want. And now that it's active, it shows here as an option, and I choose that flow and click save. You're only going to see, you're not going to see record trigger flows here. This is for screen flows. So the name matches up to the name of the flow, and now I can set my who has access to that flow. Now you have another option here, which is to create a permission set group. And you can do that as well. I like to create each permission set first and then add them to groups. One permission set can have multiple flows if you choose to do that. You just don't get the visibility here. So I am using a group and adding that flow to the group. And this is my customer service department flow access. And now all I do is add the assignments right from this group. So it's clear as day as to what I'm doing and who has access to which flow. Now we're getting into record trigger flows. And the same idea here, that we want a way to bypass our flows. And it's even more important in record trigger flows than it is in screen flows. Much more important. Because you have limits, you could be doing a large data upload, you could be bringing in some, like I do trade shows and some imperfect data, and I don't want that triggering any automation. There's a lot of reasons why you would want to bypass your record trigger flows. And I do this with custom settings. And the reason I choose custom settings for this is a couple of reasons. I don't have to do a get records. And also I can do this with a simple checkbox. And that is just so easy. And what I'm trying to do here with my custom settings is true equals on and false equals off. Make sure that you define that. You might try, your brain might work in reverse and want it the other way around. But I have a way to turn off my flow by object or globally or one flow at a time. So if I want to turn off every flow running on the account object, I can do that. And how easy is it? Right here. That's it. A checkbox. Then any flow running on that object will not run as long as they have the criteria. And this is how you do the criteria. You can do it two ways. One way, you can't do it, you have to use a formula. You can't use conditions in your entry criteria. But one way is to do a formula like this. And when you go into insert resource, these are readily available. It'll say setup, and then it'll go to those little checkboxes. It'll show you account, global, temp off, and the permission set we'll get into in a moment, and that's for my users. So I am going to debug this, and we're going to see if this is on or off. And we can see the flow did not run. And that is because you saw me uncheck accounts. This flow is running on account, and that's why it didn't run. Now, if I turn accounts back on and I debug again, here we go, we're debugging again. Now we're on. Now the flow ran. You can see how that works so simply. And we do this on all of our flows. You would want to make sure you choose how you're going to do this. And the one downside on doing it this way with a formula, and I'm going to show you an option later, is that now I can't use criteria for all the other things that I would want to have as my entry criteria. I can add to that formula, but that gets a bit messy, and then you have to remember what your criteria is. It's not so easy. You'd have to read through the formula, and you're losing, I think, a little functionality there. So what I do is I use a decision instead. And yes, it's slightly slower, slightly. I haven't noticed it to be anything that I'm worried about in time on the transaction, but there is what they say with decision sometimes a little slower than having entry criteria. But this is how I would do it. I would have off as my outcome and on as my default. And if we debug it this time, let's save it first just in case, and we can see it run. And it is on. And you can see how that ran, and you get the same functionality either way. And this is how I build it. And I have templates built in advance so that I start every flow with this already built in, and I don't have to do this every single time and start from the beginning. Now we're going to talk about permissions for our user. How do we get a user to not trigger our record trigger flows? And you start with a custom permission. A custom permission is really easy. You say new, and you just give it a name, and you save it. And then write a description for your custom permission. And then in order to use it, we have to add it to a permission set. So we're just going to create a permission set and add that permission to it. And this way, there it is. There's our custom permission. We can manage the assignment, and we could have a user add this permission. And I've built this so that it turns off any flow. But you could tweak this and design it a certain way. Probably so that it would only turn off certain flows or only use this criteria on certain flows. You wouldn't have to use that criteria for every flow. But now we're going to debug again and see what happens. Now the flow is off. The flow will not run any further than this because I have set myself with the permission to turn off the flows. And right above there where you see temp off, that is how I turn off one flow at a time. I temporarily turn off this flow because it matches this number. So you can turn off one flow at a time by object globally or by user using this approach. Now let's talk about hard coding logic. This is another best practice not to do this. And I know we've all done this in the past. I know I have, and at one time it was pretty necessary to do in some instances. But now we have a lot of ways to avoid hard coding record IDs, especially. And let's talk about that and see how this happens. The reason that you don't want to hard code IDs is that the IDs change from one environment to the other. And there's another reason, which I'm going to get into in just a moment. I'm going to show you a hard coded ID as an example. And this is record type ID. Okay, so for this flow, I'm defining that I only want this flow to run for certain record types. And so I'm going to get the ID for my client account record type, and I'm going to copy it. And then I'm going to go and I'm going to paste it. And there we are. And that's usually, and I could use that as criteria. That's valid. I could do that. But for various reasons, the other reason we don't want to do this is, how do I know when I'm debugging this flow or I'm looking at this flow and I'm having problems? How do I know? Have I memorized all the IDs in my org? Do I have any idea what that means? So that's another reason why the hard coding of IDs is not ideal. Absolutely not ideal. And so we really don't have another option until we go back to formula criteria. And if you use formula criteria, then Salesforce gives us an option. Now, if you're using formula criteria, we don't need to do this. We don't need to go down and find record type ID because Salesforce is giving us a different resource. Here we have what looks like record type ID, but we can click through and get to record type name. And now if I use this as my criteria and I get my name from my record type and get it exactly the same, there we go. I now have a criteria that is not hard coded. And this is really, really this concept. You can also get to those resources when you are later in your flow and doing assignments and everything else. It's not just available there as entry criteria. Now, another thing, we're still on the idea of hard coding, is setting values. And a lot of us have things like commission rates or discount rates and things like this that might change over time. And I can tell you in my own org, these things have changed so many times. And if you hard code them into your flows, you're going to have a hard time finding them, fixing them, and having to activate and deactivate and keep track of these changes and what the actual setting is. And will you remember what that setting is in your flow, right? If somebody asks, what is the flow setting something to, do you know? And this is how it's done sometimes, but there is another option. rather than doing it that way, now we use custom metadata for our on-off switch, and we can also use it here. So now we have custom metadata that we're using to set values. And you can use just one mapping like this. And because I name my flows with the automation number, if you aren't naming your flows with an automation number, you'll have to figure out another way. And I'm sure there's another way to do this. But I'm using automation number so that I can really easily do a get record and find the automation I'm looking for, and then the variable that I'm looking for, and then whatever values I've set for that. And you don't have to worry. I've done one as number, one as text, one as date, because when you go for assignment, if it's a number, it's only going to show the option of your number there. And by doing it this way, we have a lot more flexibility and much easier than hard coding something like this. Now, your flow is just a little more complex, and this is one way to do it, is to basically do a get records, and I've decided to separate it into two different get records and two paths, but I could do one get record and then do some filtering. And I'm looking for my commission rates. And I'm going to have them set by looking back up to my custom meta. So if you need a change, you only have to go to your mapping to make the change. We don't have to open the flow like we did before. And we do a get record, and it's basically I'm matching my automation number, and then I'm matching the name of the variable and whatever name I've decided to use. And then I'm just getting my record that aligns to that. So I'm basically getting that line of data, and then I'm making my assignment. And there it is. There is updating this opportunity with the amount from my metadata. And there's my 25 and my 10. So let's take a look. Here's the other get record for the new value, the same idea. And I'm setting my commission rate the same way. Okay, so now, and am I going to do a debug? I'll do one debug for you. And there's my trigger criteria, and run. And we can see that my rate was set, and there it is at 25. Now, another best practice, and this is so important, I can't tell you how important this is because this affects your data quality. And I did a session at Dreamforce on data quality, and I have seen orgs that have had huge data problems. And with record trigger flows, everything is happening without user intervention, and you have no idea. And you won't know if your data is being corrupted. So we need to find all the errors before the flow is running. And we need to understand that just because Salesforce doesn't trigger an error and you don't get an error message in your email doesn't mean you don't have an error, because the errors we're talking about are data errors. Okay, so we've done a get record, right? And we need to make sure that we found a record, right? Because if we don't make sure that we found a record, then we won't realize that no rate was set. So that commission rate, let's change the name of that variable so that we know we're not going to get a get record. So I'm going to make it so it doesn't match up on purpose. And see, there's no error message here. It failed to find records, but it still ran and did an assignment. So you wouldn't even know. And this is why the null check is important. So we have to do the null check before we just do these assignments, because just because you don't get a failed something, one of those error messages that send you the email and all of that, doesn't mean there's not a problem. So we need to check, did we find a value? And here we are. We're looking if we found a value. Now, what if there is no record? Do we just leave it so that it does nothing, so that the flow ends? That is not good practice, because if we do that, we're not going to know that we have bad data. So I suggest that you create a field. Now, this is a before save flow. So I had to create a field on the object, so on the opportunity. And so I have a checkbox field that I could set every time my flow finds that the data is missing. It should be there, it's not there, hello. And then we can do with that, we can have exception reports and we can have dashboards. And then I know that that record has bad data and I can fix it. I can run a report and know exactly which records have an issue. Otherwise, you may not know. And so now I'm going to fix that, and it's going to find a record, but there's another type of null. Sometimes it's not a matter of you not getting records, you have incomplete data, and this is common. And you're doing operations on data, and you have incomplete data. And you don't realize you have incomplete data because you're not looking at this record. This record is running through automation. You should be checking for incomplete data at the same time you're checking for, did we get any records? And do I have a value where I need to have a value? If I'm going to set something and I need it, sometimes there's optional fields that you don't necessarily, you'll take the data if it's there, that's great. But if it's critical field, if it's a field that I need a value, then you need some way to know that that record has an issue. And the way that you would do that would be to set some field that your no path would follow, that your error path would follow, and that it would give you data on your record so that you can do exception reports and know that your record is flawed. So if we run the debug again, it's gonna go just fine. It's all gonna be good here. But there's no data there. And the difference here is that we need to do something there. And we're writing that now as we found the records. So don't forget that second null check. Okay, last thing, duplicate record check. This is my best practice. I haven't seen this on Salesforce best practices, but I am going to include this here because data is really important to me. So let's talk about what happens with duplicates. Okay, so I'm using the same example here. Okay, now let's say, now we can avoid this when you're building your metadata type, you can make that variable name unique and not have this happen. But I'm going to show you an error that I did on purpose, is that I have two renewal rates, 88 and 25, 88%. Okay, so I have two here that are going to match up, not just one. Now, I shouldn't have done that, but I did it on purpose. So any of your data that you're doing at Get Records, you never know what the quality of that data is. And this is something I recommend. Let's do our debug real quick here. And show you again that there is no error. It just went to 88. It just chose one of the two. And so someone's getting 88% commission, okay? No error. So just because you're not getting errors doesn't mean your flows are good to go. And what we really need to do, and this is what I recommend, and we're going to get to that here, is we always need to, if we're only looking for one line of data, we always need to do a record count and make sure we're getting only what we want. And so we can't do it with the way this is already built. And I did this on purpose. The way this is built, we can't see if there's a duplicate there because we didn't get all records. We didn't go for all records. And that's what we need to do. We need to get all records and count our records. So I know we don't have a lot more time. I'm just going to get to this next little bit and so we need to do something like this. And we need to do our get records, getting all records. And then we need to count those records and make sure that we only have one. And if we have more than one, we need to set some field, some error text somewhere, or some alert, or an email, or something, however you want to do it, that you know there's an error, because otherwise you're going to get bad data. You're going to be pulling the wrong data. And that is one of my personal best practices. I always do, I'm just going to show you this last debug, I always do record counts instead of is there a record or isn't there, unless I'm sure there's only one. I have to be 100% sure that there's only going to be one. But if there's any chance that I have more than one record, I'm checking. So what you're doing here is you are doing all of your data cleanup and checks in your flow. Your flow should be doing your error checking for you. And see, we have two, and so we are going down the error path, and then we are marking that record as a problem record. And then we can have it show up in our exception reports and clean it. All right, I did it. A little long today, I apologize. And thank you, thank you. I don't know if we had any questions.
Plenty of questions coming in. So good thing we got some time left. So Amanda, this is a great question, asked, is there going to be a summarized list of all of these best practices? Because this is some great stuff.
I got these admin
slide deck available.
Okay, I can make my slide deck available. This is my best practices, but it's actually almost all of it, except what I showed you in my demo isn't really, I haven't seen it anywhere else, like exactly the way I do it and the way I talk about it. So you'll have this recording, but most of these came from admin best practices. They have a document if you look up Salesforce Flow best practices, and we can put a link on the recording, but almost everything came from their list, but they don't tell you what to do. Like they give you a list, don't use null or do a null check, but they don't tell you how. So this is why I wanted to do this session here.
Perfect. So yes, we will work on that for sure. We'll get the slide deck available along with the recording, and we'll also get a link out to that, which has some other great best practices. And we have a part 2 of best practices coming up on Automation Hour in 2 weeks as well. So Cesar asked, could you leverage custom settings to create a lookup field that points to user, select your users to then have control over whether that user has flows enabled or disabled by object? So basically, can custom settings do a lookup field to user?
I have not tried it. I don't think you can do lookups with custom settings.
I want to say that is also correct in my understanding, but I have not tried it myself. So that's like a 95% confidence answer. But I think I would agree with you.
Custom settings are more like a static thing. Now, one thing you can do that I didn't mention is in order to change those custom settings, you can build a screen flow in system mode, which I have done, and you can give one user or whoever you want access to that screen flow, and that screen flow can change those custom settings.
Absolutely.
So that
All right.
somebody won't have to get into setup and do the changes, right? You can do that. I wanted to mention that.
Absolutely. Which
And
is
that's a
also
flow you would want to control access to.
100%. That's a great use case. I do a lot of things by flow that I'm like, users, you're not allowed to touch this unless you're touching it through the flow that I built.
Exactly.
So Hashu and asked, what kind of functionality do you lose when you have to use a formula as part of your start entry criteria for a record triggered flow?
Yeah, conditions are so much easier to understand and read, and you can do more in many ways with conditions, but I'll have, so mine is like a compromise. The way I do it is I have conditions, right? So I'm using conditions to narrow down when that flow is going to run. And then I'm going in and doing the, is it on or is it off? So it has to pass through conditions first, according to the record. And then it says, am I doing anything or am I not?
Absolutely. Honestly, I don't believe that you lose any functionality. Quite honestly, there's more options on how to set a flow to run if you use the formula criteria that you can't get to using just the criteria boxes.
Yes,
So,
but flows.
I feel like it's a trick question.
It is in a way, because formulas, there is a problem when Salesforce tells you that they have performance issues. It's complex formulas, and you can, have some real complexity there that you'd have to open up that formula and read through the whole formula to understand what your criteria is too.
Yep. And this is also, I'm a huge proponent of putting comments in your formulas on what you are meaning for it to do. So in case you write it wrong, someone else can see, here's the intent, here's the problem where it's not actually doing what's intended.
That's awesome. That's great.
All right, Chris would like to know, Monica, what is your stance on having one before and after save per object versus multiple flows per object?
I start everything with one before and one after. And I like to use before whenever possible because of the speed and less complications there. And then I build as few flows as possible, meaning I like to have things grouped according to business logic. So if it's a life cycle of my record, that would be one flow, my life cycle. If I'm doing accounting, something functionality for a department, I try to put that all in one flow. I try to do that instead of having hundreds of flows, because I'm from the old days where I was with workflows, and I can tell you when you have too many, to understand the full process and how it connects to your business process is very hard.
Absolutely. We also did a great session earlier this year on automation design decisions. So there's a lot of good content there. I believe that was Tom Hoffman, and Automate This from Salesforce proper also did a kind of a debate over the different automation design patterns you could use that has some really good things for you to consider.
I also
honestly,
have one session that I did on that exact thing, and we discussed it at an architect meeting in Orlando, and that recording is available online. I'll have to find the link to it.
Fantastic. Maybe we can update the deck with a resources screen for all this great stuff. So honestly, I'm questioning whether there are truly right answers or wrong answers, and I think it has to do with asking the questions and making the decision that makes the most sense for you at the time for the company you're with.
Absolutely.
All right, next one in. If 100,000 records are coming into a before save flow, can we do a bulk update or will this update one record at a time?
Doesn't Salesforce batch it?
Well, it's a before save flow, but 100,000 records are coming in, and so that's still a record triggered flow. So my suspicion is it's actually running an interview for each record because it's record triggered, but I know Salesforce does do some batching on the back end.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, if you have that kind of record volumes, my recommendation would be to absolutely test that in a sandbox and make sure that it's going to hold up to that kind of data volume. Just because record triggered flows by definition run on one at a time. So unless you have built it to manage bulkification, which would be hard to do because the trigger is just a single record being changed, I don't know that it would do it very well. But I would absolutely advocate for test that in a sandbox. Just test, test, test.
Yes, it's hard to test that kind of volume.
Yep. And this is also where that bypass switch comes in, because a lot of times I know that when you're doing large data loads like that, sometimes it's just best to handle that kind of before save update in the data file and turn off the automation. Like if you know you need to update every single record a specific way, do that in the Excel doc. And so then you have no need to do the automation when you load it into Salesforce.
That's great advice.
But
I
that
agree.
also depends on how those 100,000 records are coming in. If it's through an API somehow, you probably don't have that option. So as always, your mileage may vary, right?
Absolutely.
All right, so we'll do one last call for questions while I double check and make sure I've caught everything off of the Trailblazer community as well. Monica, you've got some fans. Mike Kolodner said, hey and yay, not as blank. We had Maggie and Margie both who said this was a fantastic webinar, so very much.
Thank you.
Going to agree with that. And it looks like we have gotten through all of our questions today. So as always, thanks everyone for tuning in. We'll see you in a couple of weeks for part 2 of best practices. And we'll get the recording and the resources up on YouTube as soon as we can.
Thank you so much for having me. It was fun.
All right. Have a great rest of your week, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.